If you're a fan of fighting games and you've seen some of my stupid videos in the past, then you'll surely know about the iconic Dead or Alive series. With many games on multiple platforms, DOA has a long history of being known as the quote-unquote booby fighting game because of its often titillating outfits and tone, but underneath the stuff that would get my channel taken down in an instant is a legitimately fun and well thought out fighting game with likable characters, and at the end of the day, that's the core of what makes fighting games special. I've made videos covering Dead or Alive 3, Online, and DOA 6, but I realized that despite playing these games for years casually, I never actually tried playing the first game in the series. First released in 1996 in arcades and developed by Tecmo, the first Dead or Alive game was eventually ported to the Sega Saturn and PS1 before receiving a remake in the form of Dead or Alive Ultimate for the Xbox in 2004, but that's not what this video is about. Instead, we will be covering the first game specifically, and not only the final product, because we'll be discovering its history and development to find out how this series officially got its start way back in the 90s. Get ready to toss your enemies around the room like ragdolls, because we're going to explore the first Dead or Alive. The question at the moment that I'm sure some of you watching will have is, how did this series get created in the first place? I'm glad you asked, person who has a 96% chance of being male, because in a 2005 interview with series creator and most likely to wear sunglasses indoors award winner Tomonobu Itagaki. At the time, Tecmo wasn't doing so well, our name wasn't really known, and our finances were rather shaky. The management asked for a Virtua Fighter style game, only better. Timing was a big part of it. VF was considered the pinnacle of gaming excellence at the time. If Gran Turismo had been released around that time, I would have been asked to make a GT style game instead. This quote makes it clear that the creation of Dead or Alive as a series was due to the higher-ups at Tecmo ordering Itagaki to make a game that capitalized on the success of Sega's fighting game, and this went as far as the DOA devs utilizing the same arcade board that Sega used, the Model 2. At the time, Model 2 was the most advanced arcade system for third parties. Model 3 would have been great, but Model 3 was Sega's flagship board, so we couldn't have used it. Making a fighting game is all well and good, nothing wrong there, but you have to remember that in a crowded arcade with lots of cabinets all going at full volume, your game has to do something to stand out from the competition, and Itagaki figured out how exactly this would happen with DOA. In a 2004 retrospective of the series from G4, rest in peace, Itagaki stated that in his honest opinion, in order for media to truly be entertaining, it needs both violence and sex appeal. Despite this sounding like the design philosophy behind Duke Nukem 3D, Itagaki stood firm with his beliefs, and this is the reason why the future games kept increasing the number of suggestive outfits, even with Itagaki leaving the company and publicly shaming the more recent entries. It's hard to find specific information about how the Tecmo developers created the game while deep within the trenches, but we've at least established the reason behind the game's creation, as well as its method to stand out amongst the crowd. At the February 1996 AOU show, Sega announced that they were licensing their arcade boards out to third-party companies for them to make brand new games with Sega's technology, and one of these games that was first shown off at this event was Dead or Alive. The game was demonstrated to those at home for the first time in issue 17 of Next Generation magazine on page 16 in a tiny screenshot. We can see early versions of Jan Lee, Zack, and who I assume is Kasumi lying down here. This issue came out in May 1996, whereas the game itself launched in November of that year, so this is definitely an early build of the game. Aside from the aforementioned way to make the game stand out, Dead or Alive also emphasizes speed and the ability to counter enemy attacks. By using what's known as the hold button, you can grab your enemy's attack and turn it against them if they get too predictable with their attack strings, and the game also has danger zones that damage you if you get too close. If you get launched, you can be hit with an air combo by using these danger zones, so the developers wanted players to strategically think about not only when to attack, but also where to attack. Before launch, outlets such as IGN reported on a rumor that the game would potentially come to the Nintendo 64, but this never ended up happening. However, what ended up happening in reality were home conversions of the game for the Sega Saturn and the PS1. The former was a Japanese exclusive, most likely due to the sluggish sales of the system in North America, and the PS1 version was thankfully released worldwide. According to issue 34 of Next Generation magazine on page 112, Dead or Alive was the first Model 2 game released by a third party in Japan in 1996, and it's also the first game designed for Sega arcade hardware to be ported to the PlayStation. Due to the differences between these two, DOA on the PS1 has a new graphics engine, new music, and 2 new characters to tide audiences over if they played it extensively in the arcades already. Next Generation magazine's issue 104 reports on page 56 that, in fact, the development team, made mostly of the original crew that created the coin-op, has said that the PlayStation version could be called Dead or Alive 2 when referring to all the new content found in the new port. Also, the previous page of this magazine when they were covering Dead or Alive 1 contains the ungodly, horrid, phrase jiggle when they wiggle, and it makes me very happy to know that they have since gone out of print. The PS1 version of Dead or Alive contains 11 characters, and while this roster size is very small by today's standards, I won't count this as a negative towards the game. We have Bayman, a Russian mercenary, Fu, an elderly Chinese man who owns a bookstore, Jan Li, a martial artist heavily based on Bruce Lee, Kasumi, the poster girl Kunoichi of the series who abandoned her village to fight Raido, Lei Feng, a young fighter whose goal is to beat Jan Li, Raido, an evil ninja from the same clan as Kasumi, Ryu Hayabusa, the star ninja of Ninja Gaiden, Tina, an American pro wrestler, Zack, a DJ and kickboxer, Ayane, another ninja from Kasumi's clan who is out to kill her since Kasumi abandoned their village, and Bass, Tina's dad. Right from the get-go, these characters look, sound, and animate differently, which is essential for a good fighting game. From Tina's pro wrestling to Jan Li's Jeet Kune Do, you're bound to find a fighting style you like in Dead or Alive. Despite looking 3D, DOA 1 actually lacks the ability to sidestep, much like the first Tekken game, so going back to this and trying to use 3-dimensional movement to dodge attacks and create openings was a bit of a rude awakening for me. Much like Virtua Fighter, Dead or Alive is a 3-button fighting game, albeit without a block button. Unlike future games in the series, DOA 1 makes you hold back to block here, which threw me off when I first started playing it. There's punch, kick, and hold, with grabs being performed by inputting punch and hold at the same time. Characters like Tina, for example, who have multiple command grabs, make use of both punch and hold and kick and hold for special command grabs like the Frankensteiner. As far as I can tell, grabs are proximity based. If I input the command for JO Cyclone from a distance, Tina will punch the opponent, but if I do the very same input when I'm right up close, the throw will come out. This can lead to strike-throw proximity mix-ups, and I actually quite like it. In terms of overall movement and speed, it feels a lot like the future games despite being the very first one. Walking is very slow, and it can leave you open to quick low attacks, so dashing around the arena, both standing and crouch dashing, is your fastest way of getting around. As I was playing through the time attack mode, I realized that also like the future games, you can do big damage from simple strings if your opponent doesn't know how to break them. You don't have to be a Dead or Alive expert to do some really nice damage in this game, especially when the danger zones are in place. You can turn them on in training mode and practice some neat combos, and at first, I was under the impression that these explosions were essentially mini ground bounces for you to use in combos after securing a knockdown, but when you do them in a real match, the enemy goes flying super high. Trying to perfectly time a follow-up attack after one of these is tricky, but the reward is huge if you manage to do so. This is all well and good, I have no problem with it, but the true meat and potatoes of Dead or Alive's gameplay is knowing when to duck, hold, and punish. Recognizing attack strings and punishing accordingly is the most consistent way to do damage, and it's what separates the boys from the men. This is a very fast fighter with an emphasis on big damage and reading your opponent, and much like other 3D fighting games, lots of practice is required to truly understand not only your character, but your opponent's character too. Combos aren't very long, but if you fail to defend, you can easily lose upwards of half your life bar if you're hit by one, so you have to make sure that you aren't at a significant disadvantage when you're right up close to the enemy. Also, as a side note again, Itagaki wasn't joking when he said he wanted this game to have sex appeal, because my god those things are jiggling. Thankfully for Tecmo, Dead or Alive succeeded when it was released, and although it wasn't widely distributed in America, the aforementioned G4 Retrospective reports that the first game alone made a profit of $9.6 million in 1996, helping Tecmo to escape bankruptcy. I don't know about you, but that is a lot of money, especially for a new IP that was competing against Virtua Fighter, which was the king of arcades. In Japan, the game's arcade release was also a big success, and the Sega Saturn port specifically sold over 150,000 copies, while also debuting at number 1 on the sales charts. The Sega Saturn version was planned to be released worldwide, just like the PS1 port, and as such, many Saturn-focused magazines reviewed the game to generate hype in the West. Most notably of these is Sega Saturn magazine, and they stated that Dead or Alive is an incredible beat-em-up both technically and visually, even getting close to beating Sega's own brand VF games, and Computer and Video Games magazine stated that it's an essential buy for import Saturn gamers. Aside from these publication names not leaving anything to the imagination, Dead or Alive was received super well by both critics and fighting game fans. The graphics were great, the soundtrack was solid, and the hold system was amazing too, and these were all loved by those who played the game. However, even though Itagaki, between hours of intense programming and looking at Japanese booby magazines, thought that he had an amazing idea with the game's exaggerated jiggle physics, but it seems that maybe reviewers in the West didn't appreciate it as much as he did. And whoo boy, there are a lot of sources here, so you know they tore into it. The boob physics ability to be turned off in the game settings was heavily appreciated by reviewers, with Kane and Lynch 1 mega fan Jeff Gersman
Kane and Lynch Dead Man is an ugly, ugly game,
stating that they bounce around like gelatin and that these physics were just stupid. I was going to include more of these quotes, but then I realized that if I did that, I'd be sitting alone in my room writing about video game boobs for the better part of an afternoon. And I'm already miserable as it is as a House of the Dead fan, so I'll say that reviewers by and large hated Tecmo's attempts at making the game quote-unquote sexy. But overall, the game sold well and it reviewed well, so I doubt Tecmo cared about the backlash to the boob physics. Due to the game's massive success, a sequel was commissioned, and then another one, and then 3 more. And there are also other games that take place in the DOA universe that break away from the fighting game genre too, such as Ninja Gaiden, which features characters, obviously, like Ryu Hayabusa and also Ayane in pretty major roles, and there's also this game, which is the reason to take your PSP into the bathroom. At the end of the day, Dead or Alive 1 is still a fun and strategic, albeit dated game, and while I do prefer future games in the series like Dead or Alive 3 and 5, I still enjoyed my time with DOA 1. You can emulate either the Saturn version or the PS1 version on PC quite easily, and I emulated the PS1 version specifically for this video. By playing this game, I was able to see how it influenced future games in the series, and it makes me wish that Dead or Alive as a whole would continue on modern systems. I really miss this game. It's been nearly 30 years since this was released as of recording, and when it comes to old school fighting games, I never hear anyone talking about this game. Maybe that many people nowadays haven't played this game due to it not being readily available anymore, or maybe people just don't like Dead or Alive anymore because of its reputation as the Kuma fighting game. I really don't know. But if you're interested in seeing how this piece of fighting game history got started, then I recommend DOA 1 easily. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.